So I love speaking about the books I read. So why not share it on TikTok for whoever cares to listen? The best books I've read so far this year is Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon. So Frantz Fanon was a political philosopher. He was a revolutionary psychiatrist. Frantz Fanon was from Martinique, a French colony. He wrote this book in the 60s. He wrote this book in the 50s. This book is basically about the psychological effects of colonization. He explores how colonization has shaped the psyche of the colonized all around the world, but specifically of people of African descent in the French Antilles. The Black Antillian is what he called it. Martinique has a lot of brilliant minds. They also produced Aimé Césaire, who wrote the famous book Decoding, Colonialism. I read that book as well. Maybe I'll talk about it in the future. Brilliant book. But yeah, back to this book. He speaks from an Antillean perspective, but a lot of what he says resonates with me, who lived in Nigeria. The book is very small, as you can see, but it's by no means an easy read. There's a lot of medical / psychological jargon that makes some parts very tough to follow. I had to keep a dictionary on standby and read certain chapters over and over again before I fully grasped what he was talking about. Don't expect to understand everything on one read. In the introduction, Fanon quotes Aimé Césaire. "I am talking about millions of men whom they have knowingly instilled with fear and a complex of inferiority, whom they have infused with despair and trained to tremble, to kneel, and behave like flunkies." Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism. The very first sentence of this book is something I really like. "The explosion will not happen today. It is too early or too late." Chapter 1 is titled The Black Man and Language. In this chapter, Fanon speaks about the demonization of Creole in Martinique, with the preference put on real French. I'll read an excerpt that I found very interesting. "In the French Antilles, the bourgeoisie does not use Creole, except when speaking to servants. At school, the young Martinican is taught to treat the dialect with contempt. Avoid Creolism. Some families forbid speaking Creole at home, and the mother calls their children little ragamuffins for using it. My mother wanted a memorandum son. If you don't learn your history lesson, you'll not go to Sunday Mass in your Sunday best. This child will be the shame of us. This child will be our God, damn it. Shut up, I told you you have to speak French. The French from France, the Frenchman's French. French. I found that description of the demonization of Creole in Martinique very similar to the demonization of Pidgin English in Nigeria, for example. In Nigeria, a lot of parents enroll their children in very expensive private schools who spend a lot of time trying to make those little children speak like white Brits. Yes, I must watch my diction because that's how they'll judge me. He can't even speak French properly, they will say with the utmost contempt. That description almost fits like a glove with the Nigerian context. That's exactly what happens in Nigeria. The only difference is that instead of French is English. Proficiency in English is equated with intelligence, especially people that have British accents or foreign sounding accents. They are always assumed to be more intelligent than the natives who haven't quite mastered their colonizers' language. Recently on UK TikTok, there was this discourse about freshies, basically recent immigrants from Nigeria or Africa that still have their accents, their thick accents, and don't speak like the white man. There was this discourse among, believe it or not, black second generation children of immigrants, where they were basically saying one of the reasons they don't like dating freshies is because of their accents. It's crazy how they didn't see the irony. Also, from a Nigerian perspective, anytime I come across a video on social media of a speech given by a past Nigerian leader, like the Emeka Ojukwus of the world, the Yakubu Gowons, the Tafawa Balewas, people who spoke with a British accents because they were leaders of Nigeria a few years after independence. I always notice in the comment section, Nigerians in the comment section are always in awe. They're always mesmerized by their British accents, and time without number, they always complain. They decry the fact that our leaders today don't speak that way. They don't have British accents. Many, including black people, to this very day, seem to believe that if you don't speak English like a white Brit, you can't truly be civilized. Very similar to Fanon's description of his countrymen with regards to French. Among a group of young Antilleans, he who can express himself, who masters the language, is the one to look out for. Be wary of him, he is almost white. In France, they say to speak like a book. In Martinique, they say to speak like a white man. I'll review the rest of the book in part 2. I'm back with a review of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. In this video, I'm going to review chapter 2 of the book, which is titled The Woman of Color and the White Man. This chapter is probably the most derided chapter in the whole book because some people accuse Fanon of a kind of double standards because he's very scathing in his criticism in this chapter, while in the very next chapter, which deals with the man of color and the white woman, he's a bit more sympathetic. In this chapter, Fanon engages heavily with two books, I Am a Martinican Woman by Moyet Capisha and another book called Nini. Fanon is heavily critical of the book I Am a Martinican Woman. He calls it a third-rate book. One day, a woman by the name of Moyet Capisha, obeying a motivation whose reasons are difficult to grasp, sat down and wrote 202 pages on her life in which the most ridiculous ideas proliferated at random. Moyet loves the white man unconditionally. He is her lord. She asks for nothing, demands nothing, except for a little whiteness in her life. And when she asks herself whether he is handsome or ugly, she writes, all I know is that he had blue eyes, blonde hair, a pale complexion, and I loved him. The book I Am a Martinican Woman is a very bizarre book. It's basically about a Martinican woman named Moyet, who is absolutely obsessed with a Frenchman named Andre, solely because of his skin color. Fanon explores this mindset and makes the point clear that this is not love, that it's a very unhealthy manifestation of colonial racism which established the hierarchy of races, with the white man being at the top and the black man being at the bottom. Fanon also engages with the book Nini by Abdoulaye Sodji. It's basically about a mulatto, a mixed woman of Martinican heritage, who is absolutely obsessed with white men simply because of their skin color, similar to Moyet. Nini also has this contempt for black men and considers romantic interest from them almost an insult. Even though I fully appreciate the pushback and criticism this chapter received, I still think his general message is very important. This kind of neurotic behavior is still with us till this very day. I'll show you a few TikTok videos to prove that.
For all of you that have been asking me, okay, where did you get your white man? So now this is where I want to spill the tea.
If I told you been in Kampala enough or whatever, you know about Otto's Bar, right? You know about Otto's Bar. Y'all know about Otto's Bar. You can't be telling me you're looking for a white man and you don't know Otto's Bar like in
places you can meet good Oyibo. I'm not talking about Temu and Shin Oyibo. Places you can meet foreigners with good jobs. Even in Africa, like in Nigeria. 1, house party. 2, jakes.
Help. I need a white man for a serious relationship. Please, I'm 28 years from Nigeria.
The moment you date a real Oyibo man, a real, emphasis on real, yeah? Real Oyibo man, you're not going to go back. You will realize that it's like when a child has ice cream for the first time and they're like,
all these frenzied women of color, frantic for a white man, are waiting. And one of those days they will catch themselves not wanting to look back, while dreaming of a wonderful night, a wonderful lover, a white man. We know of another girl who kept a list of where you never risk meeting another N-word Parisian dance club. As you can see, the mindset espoused by these young women is almost identical to the ones espoused by Moyet and Nini. These young women don't seem to care about any other quality apart from the skin color. Just to be clear, I'm not against interracial dating, interracial love, and I'm sure Fanon is not against interracial love considering the fact he married a white woman named Josie Fanon. But I doubt this can even be considered love because they don't actually love the individual, they love the skin color, and that is not normal behavior. In the next part, I'm going to talk about chapter 3, which is titled The Man of Color and the White Woman. I'm back with a review of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. In this video, I'm going to talk about part 3, which is titled The Man of Color and the White Woman. Out of the blackest part of my soul, through the zone of her cheese, surges up this desire to be suddenly white. I want to be recognized not as black, but as white. But, and this is the form of recognition that Hegel never described, who better than a white woman to bring this about? By loving me, she proves to me that I am worthy of white love. I am loved like a white man. I am a white man. In this chapter, Fanon engages heavily with a book called A Man Like Any Other by René Morin. This book is basically about a black Antillean named Jean Venus. Jean Venus is a very educated man. He has lived in France most of his life. He's pretty successful as well. He's basically what you consider a fully assimilated black Frenchman. But he doesn't feel fully accepted in society. He feels his only option to be fully accepted by society is by getting married to a white woman. He's obsessed with this particular French girl called Andrea. He longs for her hand in marriage. Above all, he wants to prove to others that he is a man, that he is like them. But let us not be misled. Jean Venus is the man to be convinced. It is in the very depths of his soul, as complex as any European's, that his uncertainty dwells. Forgive us the expression, but Jean Venus is the man to be slaughtered. We shall do our best. Even though Andrea has shown Venus some interest, Jean Venus is anxious. He doesn't quite feel he is worthy of white love because of his skin color, so he confides in his white friend, who goes on to assure him that he's basically not like those other Negroes. He doesn't talk like them. He doesn't live like them. He's more educated than them, so he's basically not them. He's basically a white man in dark skin. How old were you when you left your country for France? 3 or 4, I believe. You have never seen your island home since, and have not the slightest interest in seeing it again, ever since you have always lived in Bordeaux. Since becoming a colonial civil servant, you have spent most of your administrative leave in Bordeaux. In short, you are really one of us. Perhaps you don't fully realize it. Accept the fact you are a Frenchman from Bordeaux. Get that into your thick head. You know nothing about your fellow Antilleans. Despite these stern assurances from his white friend, Venus is still not satisfied. He is still not convinced that he is one of them, because society still sees him the same way they see his fellow Antilleans. Fanon uses this example of Jean Venus to talk about a certain phenomenon among certain black men who seek out white women not out of love, but as a way to satisfy their longing for becoming fully part of society, to become fully accepted by white society. They feel the only other way to do that is by getting white love. It does not matter how rich they are, how educated they are, all that doesn't matter. Getting a white significant other is the most important step in becoming accepted by white society. In the next part, I'm going to talk about chapter 4, which is titled The So-Called Dependency Complex of the Colonized. Back with a review of chapter 4 of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. The title of this chapter is The So-Called Dependency Complex of the Colonized. In this chapter, Fanon engages with a book called Prospero and Caliban, The Psychology of Colonization by Xtave Menoni. In the book, Menoni argues that among the colonized people, there exists this dependency complex in their minds towards their colonizer, and this dependency complex is innate. it's natural. It even existed before colonization. Fanon thoroughly rejects this idea. He says, yes, an inferiority complex, a so-called dependency complex, does exist, but it's as a result of many years of exploitation, domination, and violence. It is by no means innate. But Monsieur Menoni will tell us, you can't, because deep down inside you, there is a dependency complex. Not all peoples can be colonized, only those who experience this need. And further on, wherever Europeans have founded colonies of the type we are considering, it can safely be said their coming was unconsciously expected, even desired, by the future subject peoples. Everywhere there existed legends foretelling the arrival of strangers from the sea, bearing wondrous gifts with them. As we have seen, the white man is governed by a complex of authority, a complex of leadership, whereas the Malangisi is governed by a complex of dependency. Everyone is happy. Menoni talks about oral traditions from various societies that spoke of strangers arriving bearing gifts. He uses that as proof that native populations were basically eager to be colonized. They were eager to have the wills of others imposed on them. Fanon obviously rejects that idea. When we endeavor to understand why the European, the foreigner, was called Wazaha, honorable stranger, when we endeavor to understand why the shipwrecked European was welcomed with open arms, why the European, the stranger, is never perceived as the enemy, instead of explaining it on the basis of humanity, goodwill, or courtesy, the fundamentals of what Césaire calls the old courtly civilizations, we are told is quite simply because something was written in fateful hieroglyphics, specifically in the unconscious, that made the white man the awaited master. Menoni basically argues that the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized is basically similar to the relationship between parents and a child, that the colonized are dependent on their colonizer. He references the Malangisi revolt of the 1940s against the French, and he comes to the conclusion that the Malangisi revolted because they felt abandoned by the French. Fanon, of course, rejects that nonsensical idea and says the revolt was a natural consequence of many years of colonial exploitation and violence. One other part of the book which Fanon takes exception was Menoni claiming that racism is basically something espoused by the poor, the lower class. Monsieur Menoni believes the poor whites in South Africa hate the blacks irrespective of economics, apart from the fact that this attitude can be understood by an analogy with the anti-Semite mentality. Thus, I would call the anti-Semitism a poor man's snobbery. And, in fact, it would appear that the rich for the most part exploit this passion for their own uses rather than abandon themselves to it. They have better things to do. It is propagated mainly among the middle classes because they possess neither land, nor house, nor castle. By treating the Jew as an inferior and pernicious being, I affirm at the same time that I belong to the elite. We could retort that this shift of the white proletariat's aggressiveness onto the black proletariat is basically a result of South Africa's economic structure. What is South Africa? A powder keg where 2,530,300 whites cudgel and impound 30 million blacks. If these poor whites hate the blacks, it is not, as Monsieur Menoni implies, because racialism is the work of petty officials, small traders, and colonials who have toiled much without great success. No, it is because the structure of South Africa is a racist structure. Yes, European civilization and its agents of the highest caliber are responsible for colonial racism. I found this video on TikTok. I think it's very relevant. Watch.
We need to give Nigeria back to the white man. I think, like, instead of this whole, like, creating new political parties, instead of doing all of that, like, just take a good look at the economy, especially compared to how it was whenever we were colonized, and just hand it over to the white man. And I don't even think that, like, there needs to be any, like, struggle. I think that we, as the next generation, should just look around and be like, this is not working. It's not. The fact that English is our national language, the official language of Nigeria, is insane. You guys fought for independence for what?
If Mosi watches that video, he'll feel vindicated. He'll feel it's proof of his theory of a dependency complex. Fanon will respond by saying the inferiority complex internalized by that young woman and the millions in Africa who think like her is a natural consequence of colonial domination. Colonial domination was what imprinted this feeling of inferiority in the minds of the colonized during colonization, which has not left till this very day. In the next part, I'm going to talk about chapter 5, which is titled The Lived Experience of the Black Man. In this chapter, Fanon talks about his experience in France. After World War II, Fanon decides to stay in France and study psychiatry and medicine. He becomes disillusioned with the racism he experiences on a daily basis. Prior to moving to France, Fanon had lived in Martinique, an all-black country, so he never had to experience the feeling of being black. He never had to experience the feeling of being othered. Look, a Negro. It was a passing sting. I attempted a smile. Look, a Negro. Absolutely. I was beginning to enjoy myself. Look, a Negro. The circle was gradually getting smaller. I was really enjoying myself. Mama, look, a Negro. I'm scared, scared, scared. Now they were beginning to be scared of me. I made up my mind to laugh myself to tears. But laughter had become impossible. In the train, instead of one seat, they left me with 2 or 3. I was no longer enjoying myself. I was responsible not only for my body, but also for my race and my ancestors. I cast an objective gaze over myself, discovered my blackness, my ethnic features, deafened by cannibalism, backwardness, fetishism, racial stigmas, slave traders, and above all, yes, above all, the grinning Yabonania. My body was returned to me, spread-eagled, disjointed, redone, draped in mourning on this white winter's day. The Negro is an animal, the Negro is bad, the Negro is wicked, the Negro is ugly. Look, a Negro. The Negro is trembling. The Negro is trembling because he's cold. The small boy is trembling because he's afraid of the Negro. The Negro is trembling with cold, the cold that chills the bones. The lovely little boy is trembling because he thinks the Negro is trembling with rage. The little white boy runs to his mother's arms. Mama, the Negro is going to eat me. Fanon is distraught. The racism wears him down, but he finds solace in reading about black history and also being introduced to the Negritude movement. Fanon was introduced to the Negritude movement by Aimé Césaire. The Negritude movement was basically about reclaiming pride in African culture through writing and poetry. Fanon starts reading works of other leading Negritude figures like Leopold Sédar Senghor, where he talks about African art. Fanon starts feeling more pride in his skin color. The feeling of finding out that he didn't come from nothing, that Africa actually had some great civilizations, fills him with pride. So it helps him cope with the immense racism he faces in France. Have I read that correctly? I give it an even closer reading. On the other side of the white world, there lies a magical black culture, Negro sculpture. I begin to blush with pride. Was this our salvation? In a frenzy, I excavated black antiquity. What I discovered left me speechless. In his book on the abolition of slavery, Sculpture presented us with some compelling arguments. Since then, Frobenius, Westerman, Delafosse, all white men have voiced their agreements. Segu, Digne, cities with over 100,000 inhabitants, accounts of learned black men. Once this has been dug up, displayed, and exposed to the elements, he allowed me to regain a valid historic category. The white man was wrong. I was not primitive or subhuman. I belonged to a race that had already been working silver and gold 2,000 years ago. Fanon engages with the work of Jean-Paul Sartre. He made a comment which Fanon took slight exception to. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote this about negritude. In fact, negritude appears as the weak stage of a dialectic progression. The theoretical and practical affirmation of white supremacy is the thesis. They know it serves to pave the way for synthesis or realization of human society without race. Thus, negritude is dedicated to its own destruction. It is a transition, not a result. A means, not the ultimate goal. When I read this passage, I felt they had robbed me of my last chance. I told my friends, The generation of young black poets had been dealt a fatal blow. We had appealed to a friend of the colored peoples, and this friend had nothing better to do than demonstrate the relativity of their action. Fanon felt Sartre didn't quite appreciate the importance of the negritude movement, even though he agreed with Sartre that negritude was basically a transitional period. He felt Sartre did not give it the importance that it needed. After some time, Fanon started realizing that there were some limitations to negritude. There were some limitations to the philosophy of negritude, rather. Even though he fully appreciated it and considered it a liberating force for him and other colonized people, he still felt it was a bit problematic, tying human dignity to a so-called glorious past. If their civilizations were indeed not as impressive as other civilizations, according to the white man, will that then mean they don't deserve human dignity? They don't deserve respect? So he kind of feels negritude is not the final stage, but it's a very important stage in freedom and liberation. In the next part, I'm going to talk about chapter 6, which is titled The Black Man and Psychopathology. Back with a review of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. In this video, I'm going to talk about chapter 6, which is titled The Black Man and Psychopathology. Here, Fanon talks about how the same Eurocentric novels and movies which were very popular in Europe were also very popular in the colonies. So in a place like Martinique, Martinican children grew up watching things like The Legend of Tarzan and other such Eurocentric films and novels who speak of the noble white adventurer, the white explorer, who left their comfort zone to go and spread civilization to darkest Africa. So Fanon says, consequently, through viewing that kind of propaganda, young black children in Martinique and other colonies would subconsciously attach whiteness to good and darkness to evil, because the civilized white adventurer is usually up against the dark-skinned native trying to protect their land. The Tarzan stories, the tales of young explorers, the adventures of Mickey Mouse, and all the illustrated comics aim at releasing a collective aggressiveness. They are written by white men for white children. And this is the crux of the matter. In the Antilles, and there is no reason to believe the situation is any different in the other colonies, those same magazines are devoured by the local youth. And the wolf, the devil, the wicked genie, evil, and the savage are always represented by blacks or Indians. And since one always identifies with the good guys, the little black child, just like the little white child, becomes an explorer, an adventurer, and a missionary who is in danger of being eaten by the wicked Negroes. They'll tell us it is not that important, precisely because they haven't given any thought to the role of these comics. In the Antilles, the black schoolchild who is constantly asked to recite "Our ancestors the Gauls" identifies himself with the explorer, the civilizing colonizer, the white man who brings truth to the savages, a lily-white truth. We have said, rather too quickly, that the black man feels inferior. The truth is that he is made to feel inferior. Here's what Chinya Achebe had to say about this same topic.
I went through university, the first university in Nigeria, and we went and did a course in English literature, and we were taught the same kind of literature that British people taught in their own universities. But I began to look at these books from in a different light. I realized suddenly that I was, in fact, one of the savages, that when I had been younger, I had read these adventure books about the good white man, you know, wandering into the jungle, on the danger, and the savages were after him. I would instinctively be on the side of the white man. I realized that I was one of those savages jumping up and down on the beach. I was not on Malo's steamer.
For example, the romanticization of explorers like Henry Morton Stanley, framing his exploits in Africa as a kind of adventure, when in reality it was just invasion, theft, destruction, and mass murder. Even someone like Stanley, who wrote in detail and was very honest about his atrocities in Africa, is still viewed in a positive light and even has a statue built in the UK still standing to this very day. Although Fanon specifically talks about his fellow Antillians in this chapter, a lot of what he describes really reminds me of the same behavior among other subjects of French colonization in Africa. Take the notorious dictator, the infamous dictator John Bedell Bokassa. John Bedell Bokassa was one of the most brutal and bizarre dictators Africa has ever had. His story is a very sad one. At 6 years old, he witnessed his dad being executed by French colonial authorities for leading a rebellion against the French. His mother soon after committed suicide because she couldn't bear with the loss. This did not make him develop hatred for the French. In fact, it did the exact opposite. He saw French culture as infinitely superior to his own. Of course, the French also did the heavy lifting in that regard. They made sure they drilled in the mind of all their colonized subjects that French culture was superior to their own. He went on to join the French colonial army. He fought in Indochina. He fought in anti-colonial wars on the side of the French. He fought for the preservation of the French Empire. Because of his exploits in the French colonial army, putting down resistance, he kind of felt he was a part of the team. He was French. Once he seized power, Bokassa went on to display one of the most grandiose waste of resources Africa has ever seen. In a country where most of the citizens were wallowing in poverty, did not have access to the basic amenities, struggled to get clean water, access to healthcare, Bokassa thought it was a good idea to stage a coronation which cost $100 million in today's money, where he declared himself the Emperor of Central African Republic in full French style because he was obsessed with their culture. Of course, with the active encouragement of the French. Interestingly, the discourse about this man, this crazy man, Bokassa, by the outside world is always in a way to mock Africans. As pathetic as he was, no doubt, nobody ever seems to want to talk about the root cause. What is the root cause of that inferiority complex? Who gave him that inferiority complex? Did he just develop it naturally? Of course not. The French sowed the seed of inferiority in all their colonies by exalting French culture and demeaning the culture of the natives. Fanon wrote something that I thought was very similar to the story of John Bedell Bokassa, but since this chapter was dealing primarily with his fellow Antillians, he said that situation did not apply to them. We are entitled, however, to ask how total identification with the white man can still be the case in the 20th century. Very often, the black man who becomes abnormal has never come in contact with whites. Has some former experience been repressed in his unconscious? Has a young black child seen his father beaten or lynched by the white man? Has there been a real traumatism? To all these questions, our answer is no. Mind you, Fanon wrote this book in the 1950s, so long before John Bedell Bokassa came into prominence. He would not have known about his story. Fanon also talks about the morbid obsession with the black male genitalia in this chapter, but I will not really go into it, it's too tough. In the next part, I'm going to talk about chapter 7, which is titled The Black Man and Recognition. I'm back with the last part of my review of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. The title of the last chapter is The Black Man and Recognition. Chapter 7 is divided into two parts. The first part, section A, deals with the black man and Adler, while section B deals with the black man and Hegel. In this chapter, Fanon engages with the work of Alfred Adler. He's a very popular psychologist. He has this theory which relates to inferiority complexes and how they develop. One of them is that every human being has an inferiority complex at a stage in their life. That is when they are children. And this is natural because when you're a child, you're physically weak, you're small, you're dependent on your parents. Fanon uses Adler's framework to discuss the inferiority complexes developed by the colonized as a result of colonial domination. Me, me, me. The Martinicans are hungry for reassurance. They want their wishful thinking to be recognized. They want their wish for versatility to be recognized. They want to flaunt themselves. Each and every one of them constitutes an isolated, arid, assertive atom along well-defined rites of passage. Each of them wants to be, wants to flaunt himself. Every act of an Antillean is dependent on the other, not because the other remains his final goal for the purpose of communion with him as described by Adler, but simply because it is the other who asserts him in his need to enhance his status. Fanon argues that this inferiority complex that has been planted in them makes them seek white approval, white recognition. Fanon sees the only solution to this unhealthy quest for white approval and recognition as a complete destruction of colonial power structures, the colonial power structures that made these feelings present. Fanon also engages with the work of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, in that and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it is only by being acknowledged or recognized. My understanding of the master and slave dialectic is basically this. Two conscious beings meet. They have a kind of struggle. The one who asserts dominance, the one who subjugates the other consciousness becomes the master, and the subjugated becomes the slave. The slave is able to attain personhood through his labor. The master then recognizes the slave as a full human being. Fanon uses this dialectic and applies it in a colonial situation and comes to the conclusion that this can never be the case in a colonial situation because Hegel's slave is able to attain personhood and dignity through his labor. But in a colonial situation, it does not matter how much the colonized black person works, how much wealth he generates for the colonizer still refuses to recognize his personhood. So basically, in a colonial situation, black people are always treated as a means to an end, and never as an end in itself, to reference Immanuel Kant. Since the colonized black person cannot receive that recognition, no matter how much work he puts in, no matter how much energy he expends, Fanon says they should stop seeking white approval because it's futile. Man is human only to the extent to which he tries to impose himself on another man in order to be recognized by him. As long as he has not been effectively recognized by the other, it is this other who remains the focus of his actions. His human worth and reality depend on this other and on his recognition by the other. It is in this other that the meaning of his life is condensed. When I read this chapter, the first thing that came to my mind was something that happened in 2022. Nigerian billionaire Tony Elumelu accepted an award of the Order of Leopold. This is an African elite, not just any random person. This is someone that is very successful, very rich, very established, but even he still feels the need for white approval. It doesn't matter if that approval comes at the expense of you, an African man, honoring a name which brought so much suffering to millions of people that look just like you. Of course, at the time he received a lot of backlash for the insensitivity of the whole thing. His apologist argued that the award in question was not named after Leopold II. Instead, it was named after Leopold I, his father. Of course, that's a very weak argument and does not make things much better in any way. I'm sure no Jewish person would be eager to accept an award named after Hitler's dad. Whether it was the father of the demon or the demon himself, that name is forever stained. That name holds a lot of power. It represents a man who 10 million Africans, enslaved many others, and mutilated many others. By accepting that award, Mr. Elumelu tacitly supported his own dehumanization as an African. Tony Elumelu never even deemed it necessary to address the criticism or apologize. Getting that white approval was clearly far more important to him than showing solidarity with his Congolese brethren. Fanon ends the book by saying this. At the end of this book, we would like the readers to feel with us the open dimensions of every consciousness. My final prayer, O my body, always make me a man who questions.